We've seen many debates on who is the best Fortnite player from season to season, but have you ever wondered who was the most dominant player throughout each entire chapter? Starting off with chapter 1, there's many different players that can take this title, and this one will be the hardest to pick since 1, it lasted for 3 whole years, and 2, the game had evolved so much from the launch up until season X. On top of all that, big competitive tournaments wouldn't really begin until season 5 with the summer skirmish. So with that all being said, let's go through some of our options here. Without a doubt, the first person to really become known as the best in the game was Ninja, and his reign at the top lasted for the first few seasons. Throughout the entire chapter, he would have some impressive performances like getting first and second in Friday Fortnite, which could be considered the first big competitive events of the game. On top of that, in those skirmishes, he would place well here and there. But other than that, he wouldn't really have any other notable placements in cups throughout the later seasons, and over time, more and more players become better than him, taking over that throne. One of those people being Tfue. And funny enough, he would actually get his name out there when he ended up killing Ninja during a game. And his come up would end up being very similar to Ninja's because it all happened before any tournaments really happened. But very quickly, he would become known as a super well-rounded player with crazy aim and extremely advanced mechanics for back then. Circling back around to those Friday Fortnite events, Tfue would dominate in them with Cloaksy, winning a handful of them. Skipping back over to those skirmishes, Tfue would really cement himself as the best back then in these events. During the skirmish weeks, he was getting top 10 after top 10, and eventually when the grand finals came, he would win it all. But his reign wouldn't end here, going on to qualify for the World Cup after winning the 3rd week of solos. However, in the finals, he wouldn't do too well. Lastly, ending off the chapter during the Season X FNCS qualifiers, Tfue would win a week, making himself 20k just from that. But overall, throughout his career in Season 0 to X, he earned himself almost $600,000, creating many clips along the way. But if you used to sponsor today's video, it would have made getting clips the easiest it's ever been. Outplayed is the ultimate free video capturing app for any game. The app automatically captures your best moments and biggest plays, but that's not it. Once you get a clip, you're able to edit it however you like, all within the app. On top of that, they make it super easy to share your clips to any social media site you want. One of my favorite features has to be that you can select how much storage you want these clips to use, so you'll never end up running out of space on your PC. So if you want to make sure you never miss out on a moment while gaming ever again, go download Outplayed for free today with the link in the description or pinned comment of this video. Now, Tfue's earnings are very impressive, but our next player somehow managed to make even more, that being Saf and Zate. These two were pretty much inseparable for the entire time they played, so I had to count them together. And for the 3rd time, we're going back to those skirmishes since that's where they really started making a name for themselves, by placing top 3 in a whole bunch of them. Also notably winning ESL Katowice. Then, not long after, the Fortnite World Cup would be announced, and Saf and Zate would end up qualifying 3 separate times in duos. Plus, Zate would also qualify for the solo finals. Saf, on the other hand, wouldn't make it in solos, but it came extremely close a whole bunch of times. Going to the finals for the World Cup, they were easily one of the favorites to win, considering they had already been super consistent at those previous LAN events. But as you guys probably know by now, they wouldn't end up winning. However, they did do extremely well and very close to winning, ultimately ending in 4th. Then in solos, Zate would place 36th. By the way, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to drop a like and subscribe because only 6% of you watching actually are, so double check. Lastly, to end off the chapter right, in Season X FNCS, their trio would end up getting 4th once again. Though that means overall, in Chapter 1, Zate earned almost $1.1 million and Saf would make over $1 million. Extremely impressive to say the least. This crazy streak in dominance is very hard to beat, but in my opinion, I think there's just one player that does beat it, and that's Aqua. Now, it's really hard to compare him and other players back then like Bugha, Savage, or Benji to those I previously mentioned because they weren't able to compete in any tournaments until online ones began in early 2019 when they lowered the age requirement to compete. So with that being said, it's really impossible to see how they would have matched up against some of the other top players back then since obviously they couldn't compete. Nonetheless, when Aqua was able to, he started off strong, qualifying to the World Cup multiple times, then obviously going on to win in duos, making himself a light $1.5 million. But the main thing that makes him stand out from the rest, and the reason I chose him as the best, is because right after winning the World Cup, he would go on to win the Season X FNCS, totaling his earnings to just shy of $1.8 million. Which 99.9% of that was only from 2019. Now, Chapter 1 was very hard to choose, and depending on your criteria, it could have been somebody completely different. But in Chapter 2, there's only really a few players that I think could take this title, which is pretty impressive on the players' part considering this was the second longest chapter, lasting just over 2 years. The first players I'll mention are once again going to be combined, and that's the GOATs of NA West, Epic Whale and Arkrum. Before playing with Arkrum, Epic Whale was already going crazy, getting third in the first season squad FNCS, then winning the very next duo FNCS with Rex, and lastly placing 6th in the solo FNCS Invitationals. Switching over to Arkrum, he would have very similar placements, with a third in duo FNCS and a win in the solo FNCS Invitationals, then a second during solo FNCS. This was already insanely impressive, but as I'm sure you all know, their reign was just beginning after they trioed starting in Season 4, going on to win 4 FNCSs in a row, then placed second in Season 8, and lastly another win during the Grand Royale. On top of all those crazy performances, Epic Whale would also get a 4th in the All-Star Showdown and Arkrum a 12th. Totaling Epic Whale's earnings that chapter to over $220,000 and Arkrum's $235,000. Like I just said, their reign over on NA West is just not replicable nowadays. But there was another set of players back then who did almost the exact same thing over on NA East, and that was Scented and Edgy. But first, they actually started off their careers on West during Squad FNCS and actually played with Epic Whale when they got 3rd place. Afterwards, both of them decided to switch over to East and try their luck against better players, also with that increased prize pool, and this would pay off massively in the long run. During Season 2 duos, they did very well for their first time on a new region, placing 9th, but it wouldn't be until Season 4 trios where things would pick up after deciding to add Commandment to their roster. Afterwards, they went on to get 2nd place 4 times in a row, then 4th in Season 8, and lastly 6th during the Grand Royale. Also in the Solo All-Star Showdown, Edgy was able to get 10th. With this streak of yet again insane performances, it puts Scented's earnings for that chapter at just under $250,000 and Edgy at just over $230,000. Now, every player I mentioned so far in this video has been very well known and had been grinding for years. But our next player is the complete opposite, and that's Miro. During Chapter 1, he didn't really play all that much, and when Chapter 2 came around, it was relatively the same, since he only played in 2 qualifiers of Squads FNCS, and during duos would actually only play on console, back when console FNCS was a thing. However, he was only able to make the heats in it. But during that same season was the solo invitationals like I mentioned before, and seemingly out of nowhere he went crazy, making his first grand finals, where he'd placed 49th. Now, Season 3 didn't go too well for him, only making heats, but in Season 4 trios, everything would change when he got the opportunity to play with Day and Reverse 2K. As I'm sure most of you know, this trio was easily one of, if not the best, during their time together, winning 2 FNCSs and placing 4th in another. Eventually, they would split going into Season 8, but Miro would make sure to keep this momentum when he played with Bugha, winning that same season, then in the Grand Royale winning once again. Just to put in perspective how insane this is, Season 2 was the first time he ever made a Grands, and out of the 8 Grand Finals he's made, he won 4 of them. Plus, this would also put his total earnings to almost $300,000 from that chapter. So far, most players I mentioned have been able to accumulate multiple FNCS wins, but even with that, there's still one player who still stands above the rest, taking the crown as the best from Chapter 2, and that's Tayson. He really started his dominance in the solo invitationals when he ended up in 5th place, by far his best performance up until that point. Right after, he would follow this up with another crazy performance, winning his very first FNCS in solos. Then, as I'm sure you all remember, he would trio with Mongrel and Mitro in one of Fortnite's most iconic FNCSs, where yet again he'd win, becoming the first player to win back-to-back FNCSs. Now, in Season 5 he would slow down with an 8th, however he did bring it back in the season right after, placing 3rd. And soon after, in the FNCS All-Star Showdown, he'd come through and take the crown for the 3rd time after one of the closest endings to a tournament we'll ever see. So far, we've gone through a bunch of his top placements, and it doesn't stop there because that same season in Trio FNCS, he would get 5th, then finally ending off the season with his 4th FNCS title in the Grand Royale, netting his total earnings throughout Chapter 2 to over $700,000. Now we're heading into Chapter 3, where things are about to switch up. From this point on, chapters only lasted for around a year instead of multiple. And there were only 4 FNCSs that were all duos, so it will be much easier to pick. To start it off, we need to mention the man who could not win an FNCS to save his life, Thomas HD. Starting off in Season 1, he would play with Tayson, getting a 3rd place, a very good performance, but ultimately they would end up splitting after getting into a little beef during a solo cash cup. And because of that, Thomas would go on to play with Tripburn for the rest of Chapter 3, where they'd place 3rd again, a 6th, then lastly a 4th in the FNCS Invitationals. Fortunately, not able to come through with that win, however, those placements still earned him over $300,000. For our next players, we'll once again combine them, and we're also going to see our first repeat player of the video, that being Bugha and Miro. Coming off of their back-to-back wins in Chapter 2, everybody was excited to see what they could do in duos, and they would not disappoint, placing 1st, 3rd, and 2nd. But when it came time to the Invitationals, their performance was quite disappointing, ending in 36th. Nonetheless, Bugha and Miro were both able to make over $150,000 from these placements. But for me, the best player from Chapter 3 has to be Queasy. He first started off duoing with Hen, and in that season, they'd end up winning. Season 2 was a little bit rough when they would end up at the bottom of the leaderboard after the first day of Grands. However, they did bring it back on day 2, ending up in 8th overall. But ultimately, they would decide to split, and that's when Queasy and Vino would form, starting the reign of one of Fortnite's most iconic duos. Ending off that last half of the chapter with a 3rd, then lastly a 2nd place at the FNCS Invitationals. With all these insane performances, that puts his earnings for Chapter 3 at just shy of $400,000. I do want to also mention Vino could have easily been swapped out here as the best, but I chose Queasy just because he had slightly better placements. Finally, we're at Chapter 4, and this one was very hard to pick because there's a lot of players that from one season had an insane performance, then the next one just fall flat. For example, Queasy and Vino made history, winning 6 out of the 12 games in Grands and obviously winning it all together, but then that next season, they didn't even qualify for the heats. A duo that was extremely consistent on the other hand is Acorn and Cold. They started strong with a win in Season 1, then a 6th in Season 2, and another 6 right after. Then finally a 7th at the FNCS Global Championship. And interestingly enough, they tried to split after that first 6, but this chapter Acorn made over $220,000 and Cold over $160,000. Showing up again on this list for the 3rd time is Miro. Season 1 wasn't that good for him, and he technically retired right after, but decided to come out of retirement to play with an underrated player, which would ultimately be Cooper. Their first 2 seasons were very good with a 2nd and 9th place. Then, as you should all know, they would shock the world by winning the FNCS Global Championship, totaling his earnings those seasons to almost $570,000. Finally though, we're at the best player of Chapter 4, and after much debate, I think Kami takes the cake for this one. Just like Miro, he didn't start off strong, but afterwards was able to place 5th and 4th. Also, during this time, he ended up winning the Zero Build Gamers 8 LAN, adding a nice little chunk towards his earnings. But what really cements him as the best for me was their insane comeback during the FNCS Global Championship, which resulted in them finishing in 2nd place. This also means at official Epic hosted LAN events, he has an average placement of 1.5, which is just insane to think about. With all that being said, that makes his Chapter 4 earnings come out to over $700,000. Now we're at the current chapter, and obviously it's not over yet, but I'm gonna give my prediction for this one. I really think the best answers here are only from 2 duos. That being Acorn and Cold, the champs of NA, and Malibuca and Mustache, the champs of EU. And honestly, this one could go to either of them and I wouldn't be too mad, but in the end, I think Malibuca and Mustache, specifically Malibuca, comes out on top here, just because of how much he stands out in solos. Now, most of these players probably played countless 1v1s during their careers, which have probably become extremely boring at some point, and I'm sure you've experienced this too. So I decided to make gun game 1v1s as a fun way to spice up the classic build battle. So if you're interested, go check out my map with the code or search it on your screen. And if you guys made it this far, please do drop a like and subscribe. We're trying to hit 100K by the end of this year. I hope you all have an amazing rest of your days. Peace out.